Good day, my name is Gloria Minot, and I'm most honored to be your guest host today on Streets, where I strive to reach, educate, and transform society's views on homelessness. On April 2nd of this year, Mayor Adrian Fenty and a host of distinguished individuals presented to the District of Columbia, and most specifically the homeless residents of the district, a Housing First plan. Joining me today is Mr. Clarence H. Carter, serving as the District of Columbia's Department of Human Services Director since his appointment by Mayor Adrian Fenty on July 5th of 2007. This position is a cabinet-level position with responsibility for all income assistance support programs and related welfare-to-work employment programs, early care and education subsidies, and quality improvement programs. Those initiatives, of course, is under his auspices, and a wide spectrum of social service programs, including adult protective services, teen pregnancy prevention efforts, and homeless services. Mr. Carter, welcome.
Gloria, it's my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon.
Nice to have you. So let's talk. In December of 2004, the district adopted the Homeless No More plan, designed to improve the quality of life for all residents of the district by preventing and ending homelessness within 10 years. Quite ambitious, isn't it?
Quite ambitious.
So what are the goals and objectives of this program?
Well, the goals and the objectives are pretty straightforward. It is that it is not appropriate for us as a society to simply warehouse our homeless neighbors. We actually have to understand the root causes and move to first reduce and then eliminate homelessness.
The District of Columbia's 10-year plan, which has three principal elements. One was to expand prevention efforts in the district, and that certainly has happened. A second initiative was to look at all kinds of mainstream wraparound services, both public and private, to make them more effective in their service to homeless people. And thirdly, the creation of 6,000 units of housing dedicated towards housing the chronically homeless.
We have previously really focused on only maintaining it. And what I mean by maintaining it is, it really is providing shelter and that most basic need. But really, Homeless No More laid out a blueprint for actually ending homelessness in the district.
And so you have a timeline.
There is a timeline. The Homeless No More initiative lays out a 10-year timeline by which we would first reduce and then end homelessness in the district. Yes.
In fact, all across the country, both large metropolitan areas as well as rural areas and small jurisdictions are all putting together 10-year plans to end homelessness. This is as a result of an initiative by the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, which encouraged jurisdictions all across the country to take a look at chronic homelessness. And that is homelessness in the instances where there are long stays in shelter or multiple episodes of homelessness.
How do you plan to go about implementing this blueprint? And what will be different about your program that was not contained in previous programs in the district?
Well, there are a couple of aspects that are very important, Gloria. And the first is, as I just said, previously we really had an approach in which we addressed the issue of homelessness by simply providing shelter. In other words, we have a number of facilities all across the district where an individual or a family who was homeless could reside while they were homeless, okay? What is an important difference, a fundamental difference in what we are doing now, is actually while we shelter an individual, we also are going to understand the root causes of homelessness for that individual or for that family and build a plan to actually grow that individual or that family beyond homelessness. So it is not appropriate for us simply to house, but literally we have to focus on helping that individual or that family reintegrate into society to actually have not only a home, but be able to make their lives work. So that's one important aspect. A second important aspect is the kind of housing that we will provide. We have previously had an awful lot of large congregate shelters, okay, where many individuals who were experiencing homelessness were all, if you will, corralled. And it has just been a failed public policy experiment to bring mass numbers of individuals together experiencing the same challenges. And so what we are moving to do is to change our shelter stock to smaller stock. In many instances, it will be individual apartments. The Homeless Services Reform Act requires that for families, but we want to also bring that kind of stock to individuals. And so we also are going to change the kind of stock that we have available to us. And so I guess the final thing of what is important about what we are currently doing is really a focus on helping individuals get through homelessness and really not just manage them in it.
Let's talk about resources.
Sure.
Because no plan is complete without the adequate funding.
That's right.
And then someone will tell you there isn't always adequate funding. But tell me, how does the DC government plan to fund this program?
Specifically, in the 2009 budget, the mayor proposed $19.2 million for what we have called a Housing First initiative. And it is an initiative which will house 400 of the most chronically homeless individuals and 80 families. And so it provides money for housing and also for services that need to be attached to those individuals and families so we can grow them beyond homelessness. So that $19.2 million is specific money that has been dedicated to this initiative for 2009.
I heard you talk about moving hundreds of families and the chronically ill into the first phase of the housing.
That's correct.
Let's talk about the figures when it comes to homelessness in this city.
Right.
What figures are we talking about?
Gloria, the most recent point in time data, and what happens is annually, the Washington Area Council of Governments, it's the 9 jurisdictions in the Washington metropolitan area, on one night in January, actually go around and count the number of homeless people who are on the street and in shelters. And that latest information has a little bit more than 6,000 individuals who are either on the street or in shelter in Washington, D.C. proper.
So you see, you're telling me about hundreds where you have thousands on the streets. And once you move the chronically ill and the families out of the equation,
right.
What would you do with the others?
Well, let me just push back a little bit. There are not thousands on the street, okay?
Or in shelters in across the city.
In fact, we have about 315 individuals are experiencing street homelessness during the winter. But the idea is you focus on understanding their need, getting them into appropriate housing, this sort of single apartment. And our attempt is that we will start this with 400 individuals and families now, and then we will simply roll that intervention on until we have served all the district's homeless.
Mr. Carter,
Yes.
Thank you so much. Now joining us, we have Christy Respris, who has been the Director of Programs and Development at Pathways to Housing, Inc. That's in the DC area for the last 3 years. Prior to that, she worked with Pathways to Housing, Inc. in New York City, which is credited with the creation of the Housing First model of providing permanent, supportive housing to persons who are chronically homeless. In addition to her work in the district, Ms. Respris travels around the country providing technical assistance to other communities who are replicating Pathway to Housing First model. Welcome.
Thank you, Gloria.
My first question to you would be, tell us about Pathway to Housing and how did it get involved in this idea of providing housing first?
Sure. Before I get kind of right to that answer, let me just paint a little bit of a picture, present who it is that we have, our mission is to serve.
As a matter of fact, I would have gotten to that, but go right ahead.
Sure. So, you know, I want you just kind of to think about, you know, if you are a resident of the district and you walk down the street, especially in the downtown area, you might be able to picture some of our homeless neighbors, people who may be in the same spot every day, that you're seeing them frequently, who might be surrounded by many of their belongings, people who you come across day after day after day, who might, you might think that they have some disabilities, who may or may not be able to meet some of their basic needs on the street. This is who Pathways serves. We reach out. Our mission is to work with people who have been on the street for many, 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 many years, and also are living with some serious disabilities, typically serious mental illness, and also some other disabilities, perhaps some physical disabilities, addictions, co-occurring disorders. And what we do is when we first meet a person, we ask them a very simple question, which is, how may I help you? And typically the answer to that question is, I need housing. I'd like housing.
I've slept in hallways. I've lived in abandoned buildings. I've been through it, so I know what it's like. But you got to start somewhere, and this is one of the very best places to start. There's no rigid demands. It's, what can we do to help you? What is it that you need most?
Started in New York about 15 years ago with this idea of just listening to the people that we work with and offering them housing first.
I think even in situations where there are issues of mental illness, substance abuse, HIV and AIDS, none of those things are barriers to providing housing. I think all of those problems are far more easily solved when the individual is housed. If you compound those issues with the absence of housing, you've made it even more difficult to address the underlying conditions.
What happens next is that we provide very intensive support services to help people stay in housing for the people who need that, and especially the people that we are working with who, again, have some disabilities and some other need some support services. We have very intensive teams, and actually Clarence mentioned this earlier, this idea of supportive housing. Once we move people in, we surround them with services according to their needs, what they're able to identify as the things that they need. Psychiatric services, addiction services, helping them find work, reconnecting with family, and really meeting their medical needs as well.
Let me get back to something you said initially.
Sure.
You go and get your clients, so to speak, from the streets.
Mm-hmm.
You literally pluck them from the streets.
Mm-hmm.
How do you determine that they are ready to live in an apartment by themselves if they suffer from a variety of problems, mental and otherwise?
Oh, Gloria, that's a great question, and that's a question that we're asked quite frequently. The idea of housing first, you know, we have typically in our system what we do is we have people, and Clarence mentioned this, is that people have to go through a lot of hurdles, kind of a lot of hoops to get into housing. They might have to show that they have been clean and sober, is a term people use, not drinking or using drugs. That if they have a mental illness, that they have to show that they've been taking psychiatric medication. A lot of hoops that people are required to go through before being offered housing. What we found is that it's not necessary. We don't need to provide people with long periods of transitional housing or being ready for housing. What we found is that giving people housing immediately and then giving them the appropriate support services is just as successful, actually more successful than providing people or forcing people into these kinds of transitional housing situations.
Mr. Carter, sounds like a good match, both of you.
It absolutely is. It's a perfect match where we have a service provider who intimately understands the challenges of the chronically homeless, those individuals who really are, from a homeless perspective, some of the most broken people in our society. And Pathways has developed really the preeminent model for how to help that neighbor be able to begin to make their lives work. And they've really come to understand that if you address that housing need first, then that individual can become ready for all those other necessary support services to help them stand up. It is a wonderful alliance.
Christy, what kind of costs are we talking about for an individual or a family? Give me the breakdown.
I know that we work with individuals who then reunite oftentimes with families. So in terms of individuals, I have to tell you, Gloria, it's much less expensive to actually put people into housing with very intensive support services than to keep them homeless and living on the street. When people are on the street, they often are using very expensive services that the city provides. For example, emergency medical services, fire, police, and ambulance services, the DC jail. These are very expensive services to provide to people. When people come into housing, the use of these services typically goes down very quickly. And what the costs are for our program, which is the most intensive level of care, the supports that we provide to people, plus housing, is about $22,000 a year, which is less expensive than a bed in the DC jail for sure, or for certainly time in St. Elizabeth's Hospital, or even a shelter with support services.
And Gloria, if I could just add, the important thing is that we are paying that cost of serving that individual one way or the other. We are actually, we find that it is less expensive, as Christy mentioned, to do this front-end intervention to help that individual stand back up than to actually do the back end of either incarceration or our emergency services system. So society pays the cost for serving that individual. We can actually reintegrate that person for less cost than the other services of the back end.
How did you find each other?
We actually found each other through this announcement when the mayor held the press conference to talk about this Housing First initiative and some complementary strategies to address homelessness. The leadership of Housing First was watching this, and they contacted us right away and said, "Hey, that's what we do. We really want to be a part of this." And so it really was very, very fortuitous. And Gloria, from my perspective, Pathways to Housing helps you understand that the government doesn't have to do this by itself. We have wonderful partners that are available to us if we will only reach out and link together. The whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts.
Have you formed such partnerships? I know you have that relationship with her organization, but tell us about some of the other organizations that you might have formed, like alliances.
Well, and let me start with some inside government relationships. For instance, the Housing and Community Development Authority, the Housing Authority, okay? Those are organizations in DC government. The Department of Human Services is not housing, okay? And so therefore, we have sister agencies that's what they do. And so we partner with them. So again, we are all doing that which we do best, but it ultimately serves the customer.
One of the features of this new plan is that all of the district agencies are to retool their grant processes to put together consolidated streams of funding as well as application processes, so that agencies that want to address the problem can have, if you will, a one-stop process to be able to create the housing.
It really is this kind of notion that if we link hands as a society, with each of us doing the little bit that we do well, then that together makes enough to be able to serve all the needs of our city.
Mr. Carter, let's talk again, because it's always good talking to you, considering that you're the one person within this framework here today that can tell us all we need to know about the government's plans. Plans are to move people from the temporary shelters they're in.
That's right.
Along with Pathway to Housing, making permanent their living situation. So, and the plan is 10 years.
The Homeless No More plan initially it had a 10-year horizon from when the plan was adopted in 2004. Then by 2014 we would have moved to end homelessness in the district and laid out a number of strategies by which we would go about doing that. And Gloria, if I could to really to kind of rope back in and highlight what I talked about in the previous segment of, it's not enough to simply house. We understand that if you want to actually help that individual grow beyond homelessness, well, housing is first. That's the front door. But then with that, you have to combine supportive services that are specific to the challenges that that individual or that family has. And when you do that, when you custom tailor that service mix to that individual, then you have a formula which helps them grow beyond the circumstance. And so what's exciting about this time and this opportunity is the district has drawn a hard line in the sand and said it is no longer appropriate simply to provide shelter, okay? That we want to, as an enlightened and compassionate community, we believe that it is our goal to help our homeless neighbors to grow beyond that condition, that is not an acceptable condition in our community, and we will certainly serve the condition, but we will serve the condition from a perspective of helping people to grow beyond. And I just think it provides an exciting new moment in the history of this great city.
I am optimistic that this administration has all plans in place to make this happen within the time frame allocated. What will happen to this program? Because I heard you mention that 2004 was when this came into being, correct?
When the plan was first adopted, that's correct.
What happens if, let's say, another administration comes along, the program is incomplete? What then? Well,
here's what it would be our hope. First of all, this mayor adopted a plan which was a plan of a previous administration, okay? And what we hope is that we have so well defined this and have so much energy that no one could stop it. That's what our hope would be.
Ms. Respis, Mr. Carter, again, we'll continue this conversation. Now let's shift gears and take a look at another part of this April 2nd conference that has been dealing with the closing of the Franklin shelter, located around 13th and K Streets in Northwest, in the heart of downtown DC. Now joining us is Mr. Eric Sheptock, a resident of the Franklin School Shelter who came to DC in August of 2005 to engage in anti-Bush activism. In June of 2006, he became one of the founders of the Committee to Save the Franklin Shelter, which later became Until We're Home, Inc., a nonprofit whose goal is to ensure better services for DC's homeless population. He often writes editorials for Street Sense and is presently involved in various forms of homeless advocacy. Eric, how are you?
Fine. How about you?
I'm doing fine now that you're here to talk with me. So, will the imminent closure of the Franklin School Shelter and the creation of permanent supportive housing help the residents, the homeless residents of the city?
The Franklin School Shelter? Well, no, because the 400 units of permanent supportive housing that are being manufactured this year are going to be given to homeless people from all over DC. They're not being allocated just for the men at Franklin School Shelter, and so those men at Franklin might get as little as 2 dozen or less of those units. And so the vast majority of the 300 men at Franklin School Shelter are still going to be homeless, and they're going to get moved to other shelters, which is going to be a lateral move in one sense, but actually by you moving them to other parts of town that they're not familiar with, you're actually moving them down. So it's not even a lateral move, it's a downward move.
So your concern is that there is fierce competition for the permanent housing that's set out in this plan, and that the members of the Franklin School community will not have an adequate amount of these houses to take care of your needs permanently?
Right. Well, first of all, you have to understand that the vulnerability index that the DC is going to use to determine who gets these 4 units first has not even been clearly determined, and therefore we don't know how many of these guys at Franklin are going to get these units, and then like I said, they're going to get moved all over, and to areas that they're not familiar with, and so I don't think that enough of the guys are going to get housing to justify closing the shelter.
Mr. Carter, how would you respond to what Eric has said?
A couple of ways, and Eric and I have had this conversation, and it's been ongoing for us, and I think that he speaks articulately for the Franklin School Shelter community. But there are a couple of issues here. first is that Eric mentioned that maybe as few as 24 of the men in Franklin would be on the priority list for this first set of 400 vouchers. That is unclear to us. We don't know at this point what would be the number. What we wanted to do first is to develop a fair process by which we focused on those individuals that were the most chronically homeless to be able to begin this process. Now, we don't stop here, but this is where we start. So these first 400 will focus on those which are the most chronically homeless. And Eric is accurate that this program is not tailored specifically to the men in Franklin. And so as we use our mechanism to determine the priority listing here, okay, some of the men in Franklin, it's not clear to us what number that would be, but some of the men in Franklin would then be eligible for this first set of permanent supportive housing. And then, but by the idea that we would have moved a total of 400 individuals who are currently homeless, that we would have moved them into permanent supportive housing, it would create vacancies in our overall shelter system, which would allow us to move the men in Franklin to other places. Eric's issue there is that men are going to be moved to places in the city where they are not familiar with, okay? And so therefore it's a step downward. In all candor, Franklin School Shelter, it was not built for that purpose. It is a building which is not in any way, shape, or form suitable and for the purpose that we currently serve. We put hundreds of thousands of dollars into that building to attempt to accommodate it for that purpose. And so because it is not appropriately suited for that purpose, that is the rationale for us to close it. We will, over the course of time, the men that are currently in Franklin, as we move forward and there are more resources available, we will get to our entire homeless population. So over the course of time, everybody will have this opportunity of permanent supportive housing.
Well, you see his concern, though? His concern, as I understand it, is that you're talking about permanent housing for some of the people who you're going to move out. You're going to move them out based on whatever the criteria might be,
right,
depending on their mental health, whatever the vulnerability index is, which
That's
I'm going
right.
to ask somebody to explain
Sure.
to me in a moment.
Right.
But based on that, you're going to move people from the shelter to elsewhere.
Can
you see why he's concerned about what happens to the rest of that population?
Oh, I can absolutely understand the idea of one, this is the place that I know and have the greatest access, to the things that make my life work here. Okay, and I wouldn't have as great an easy access to that if I am in other parts of the city, if I'm not downtown. That's very clear. And when you add that to the unknown, okay, I mean, even if this were not the best accommodation for me, I understand this, okay? I know this, and so therefore, you're telling me right now about an unknown, something I don't know anything about. So when you add those two things together, I do understand the discomfort. What I have asked of Eric and the men in Franklin Shelter is that I've said that we really do have, now we have some history with doing what we are proposing to do here. Not long after I got here, we closed DC Village, which was a family shelter, okay? And we took exactly this same approach, okay?
Is it a success story?
It is a huge success story. It's a huge success story. And some of the individuals in DC Village, because we used this same sort of mechanism where it was about the length of stay in shelter, and this vulnerability index that Eric speaks to, is we want to accompany the length of stay in shelter along with looking at those factors that are the greatest vulnerabilities, things like substance abuse, mental health issues, those kinds of acuity. So you marry those two to determine who's the most chronically homeless, and then so that creates our priority. But as I said, as we closed DC Village, we took exactly the same approach, and because we were able to move more than 200 families from our entire shelter system, we were then able to move families in DC Village into other shelter space that had opened. Now, I would tell you that it is not our optimum to be able to move the men in Franklin to other shelter space. It is our optimum to grow them beyond homelessness. But there is a continuum in which we will follow here. And we just believe that that is not an appropriate facility for individuals. So as long as we ensure that we do provide shelter while we make more space available, and while we also find more permanent supportive housing resources, that it's okay to, that we are meeting the objective of sheltering the individuals.
Eric, I know you want to get in here. Please do.
Well, I can say a mouthful to what was just said, but I'll start with this. Well, first of all, a lot of renovations have been done on Franklin School Shelter. In the past 15 months, they've added 4 brand new heating units to the building, 2 brand new water heaters, a fire alarm system. They've renovated all the bathrooms. They've done a lot of painting and a lot of pest control and so forth. And so Franklin actually is not ready for the summer. There's no AC in Franklin, but it is ready for the winter. You got this brand new heating unit that was just put in this past November. And the new water heaters, like I said, and so Franklin is ready for the winter. You're going to close it on October 1st, right before hypothermia sets in, and that doesn't make an awful lot of sense. And then also, it's between 2 metro stations. It's near a lot of bus routes, and so it's in a prime location, especially for anybody who wants to go to work. Out northwest, that are within a mile or 2 of Franklin School Shelter, and if you move the guys 2 or 3 miles in any direction, then they're going to be beyond walking distance to things like Miriam's Kitchen or SUMS or the Indian Program for Homeless Women or so forth. There's so many different services that are there for them, so you have to move all the services too. And so, you know, that's the quick rundown of the problems you'd run into.
Let me ask you this. What exactly is your conclusion as to why the men are being moved from the Franklin School Shelter?
Well, I'm going to shoot from the hip on this one. You see, I think that DC government feels like they're just an eyesore because everything around Franklin School Shelter is so built up, so developed. You got buildings that look like they're less than 10 years old around Franklin School Shelter. And then Franklin is the oldest building, you know, in that area. And you know, it does look rather old from the outside. You can fix it up. I mean, I'm sure you could, but it is the worst looking facade. And so I think they want to move the guys out and renovate the building and turn it into something that'll make money for the area, and that they feel like the homeless men are an eyesore, and they bring down the value of that neighborhood by being there.
Do you concur, Mr. Carter?
I absolutely don't concur. And you know, the one thing that, and I think that Eric would agree with this. Since I have, in my short tenure here, my short 10 months in the district, we have been transparently honest with everybody for what this approach has been. Okay, what our rationale for what we're doing, and how we were going to go about it, and we have gone right to the customer that we are attempting to serve and explained our motives. Okay, and the motive here for me, and since I am the person with the responsibility of executing this, okay, and I have been in conversations with the mayor and the city administrator, and what the mayor said to me is, he said this when he was on council, that was an inappropriate place for us to house homeless men. It was an inappropriate place for that. And
why did the mayor think it was inappropriate to use it for homeless housing?
The reason it's inappropriate is because I have gone through my email, and Eric and I have become email buddies. In the short time that I have been here, I have gotten 137 emails from Eric. He's a wonderful advocate. And
in a space of how many years?
10 months. 10 months. And 122 of those emails are about problems in Franklin. 122 of the 137 are about problems in Franklin. He is an articulate advocate for the challenges in that building. Okay, and I don't think that there is nobody who would say that there is something sacred to that particular building. Okay, I believe that the sacred covenant that the district has with its homeless neighbors is to provide safe and affordable shelter while we help them grow beyond. So because that building is not, it is not near what it should be, it's not near the quality that our homeless neighbors deserve, we're going to close that building and provide different shelter.
Mr. Espris, okay, Eric,
Okay.
this is your...
Okay, well, first
Have
of
your
all,
say.
I doubt those numbers in terms of how many emails I sent about what's wrong with the building. I mean, and I'm pretty sure that some of them were repetitive because of the fact that something had not been fixed the first time that I emailed the problem. But I don't see myself having sent that many emails about things being wrong with the building. But what else I want to say is this, though. What you have to remember is that previously that there was a lease on the building. That lease has since been annulled. And there's no intended use for the building. And so what you're going to end up with is that Franklin's going to be an empty building, and then you're going to have homeless people that need somewhere to stay, and those were the very circumstances that created Franklin School Shelter in the first place. And then you're going to close the building right before hypothermia sets in, and then you're going to find out that you need more space, and you got these heaters and this water heaters in the building, and you're going to say, well, heck, the building's ready for winter, move them back in.
And I think in that regard, Gloria, I think what is important is that Franklin and DC Village were a part of, in all candor, a lack of planning on the part of the district. Nobody ever planned for either of those to be shelters long term. They were absolutely meant as short-term solutions, and we just, because we didn't plan, we've just went on and on and on until this mayor said no more. We had never planned for that to be a long-term shelter when it was open, and I think Eric would agree with that. Right. And so therefore, it's not, okay, so well, let's do it this year, let's do it next year, let's do it the next year. No, let's draw a line in the sand because we never saw that as being part of the permanent stock. Let's do what's in the best interest of the customer that we serve and get ourselves better facilities.
Okay, well, I should add this too, though, that when I began with the Community St. Franklin Shelter, there were 240 beds in Franklin School Shelter. And then a short time later, they added 60 beds to Franklin School Shelter. Yeah. So now it has 300 beds. And so while you're talking about closing it down, you're showing that you need the additional capacity because you're adding 60 beds.
And we are providing for the additional capacity. In other words, we are not going to have 300 fewer capacity because we close Franklin School Shelter. Again, I'll go back to our DC Village model, okay? We closed DC Village. That was 115 units of family capacity. We ended up adding 212 units for a net gain of capacity. And we will do exactly the same here in Franklin Shelter. Yeah, it will be different kinds of capacity.
Let me get Ms. Respis in here. She's been sitting patiently, and this indeed is a three-way, four-way conversation. Okay. What are your thoughts on what you've just heard?
Well, I think the most appropriate people are the people here I am actually sitting next to. I think that they both mentioned services. That, people have various needs at Franklin, and I think Eric knows best. You're there, you know what people need. And I think, from our perspective, again, is that it's about permanent housing. How do we expand the permanent housing stock in the city to make sure that people have access? The housing in this city is not affordable. For the working wage that people make. A lot of folks at Franklin, I understand, are working part-time, some full-time, but even at that rate, they cannot afford the housing in the district. So how do we make sure that the housing we provide is permanent, that there's enough stock, and that we meet the needs of the people who are vulnerable, who are there, who aren't able to rise out of the situation of homelessness, even if offered the permanent housing without some other supportive services.
But what you need to understand too is that a lot of the homeless people actually feel connected to the area that Franklin is in, to the Ward 2 area. And therefore, if you shut down Franklin and you open up shelter space elsewhere, they aren't going to go. They'd rather sleep in the storefronts. And so what essentially is going to happen is that by the guys not choosing to leave that area and sleeping in the storefronts, the same guys who were declared to be an eyesore, rather indirectly as it may have been, are now going to be even more visible because you're going to have even more of them sleeping in parks and storefronts. And then finally, I'll say this, which is that, you shouldn't get rid of what you got until you get something better. And so don't close down Franklin yet until you're sure that you have enough space that people are actually going to use. I mean, because if you're going to have housing first, make sure that you actually have the housing first before you close the shelter, right?
And again, to go back to our DC Village model, which is exactly the same thing here, we had a goal of taking that shelter, that inappropriate shelter, out of our family inventory. And so we found at the same time that we closed the front door of DC Village, developed 212 additional single-family units, okay, and moved individuals in so that as we closed that front door and no more folks went in, we were able to empty it, okay. So no one was put out in the street, and no one will be put out in the street as we move forward. We will identify new stock and in an organized fashion assess folks and move them into this new housing. And I think the thing which I guess would be my prayer is that Eric has painted a pretty bleak picture of the future where the men in Franklin are going to be sleeping in storefronts. Okay, when we began what we began at DC Village, okay, I think that if anybody were to bet, they would have bet that we would not have been successful. But we have wonderful success stories. First of all, no one was displaced, no one was in the street, and we have wonderful success stories about families beginning to recapture their lives. And so that would be what I would present as the vision of where we go here, where men not sleeping in storefronts, okay, not sleeping in a building which is inappropriate, but for us beginning to identify their service needs as we move them I won't argue, as we move them to other facilities in the short term, but we begin to address their service needs and help them recapture their lives. So I don't see a stark, bleak picture of the future. I see that we have laid out a very aggressive and a very forward-looking plan that will actually help all of the individuals and families who are suffering with this the despicable condition of homelessness, how we help them recapture their lives. That's the picture.
Eric, you have clearly not seen a lot of optimism in the mayor's plan.
Right.
For you, what would be your ideal situation?
The ideal situation would be to keep Franklin open until we move the guys into housing, because I think he misunderstood my point when it said about the bleak picture that I was painting there. Because, you know, if you move the guys from Franklin into housing, they'll run for that. But if you move them from Franklin to another shelter, which is further from what they're used to, then they're going to go to the storefronts and the parks. So they'd be glad to go into the housing, but until you get the housing, keep them in the area where they're at. Because like I said, you know, moving to another shelter, it's not even a lateral move, it's a downward move, because you're going to an area that you're not familiar with. And that's going to be the primary issue that you're going to have to deal with. And then what else you have to remember too is that Franklin is not a family shelter. Franklin is a low barrier shelter. And low barrier basically means that you got the hardest people to deal with. You know, you got the highest percentage of things like drug use or mental illness or what have you. And so you're comparing apples and oranges when you compare a family shelter to a low barrier shelter.
Mr. Sheptalk, I'm going to have you explain to me when we continue this discussion what the vulnerability index is. I never got to that, but I'm going to ask you to do that. Thank you so much for joining me in this segment. And last but not least, I'd like to bring on an old friend and continued champion for homeless advocacy, Mr. Jesse Smith. I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Smith in his days to save the Franklin shelter some time ago, and I'm so glad to be back with him today. Unfortunately, we're back at the same place, the closing of the Franklin shelter. Jesse's a DC native, married for 30 years, has a BA in sociology and urban planning, worked for a large major telecom giant for 27 years. First and foremost, he's a part of the committee to save Franklin shelter. Jesse, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm fine, Gloria, and thank you so much for having me here.
And thank you for
always to see you.
Always a pleasure to talk with you. As you can tell by now, we do know each other. So,
Quite well.
Tell us about your successful efforts to save the Franklin shelter the first time around, and what advice would you give to both Eric and Mr. Carter?
Oh, I'll be more than happy to. If I may say, let me announce first of all that I'm coming from a primarily historic perspective, because my good brother and friend, Mr. Eric Sheptalk, is current right now. So, but in any case, and as you stated before, we're right back at the place that we were before. A bit of history, if I may. The original closing of the Franklin shelter was done under the previous mayor, Williams. Again, there was an idea of a displacement of persons who really relied on the meager service. Knowing, again, as Eric explained, this is a low barrier shelter, so the services weren't that great to begin with. But
well, how do you determine low barrier? What does that mean?
A low barrier shelter is a facility that accepts without any real stipulation as to who you are. The idea is to provide you a bed for the night and perhaps a meal. That's it. The idea, you might have some services depending on where it is or how long the place has been, but the Franklin shelter had none. I will pretty much say that. Or if I may, really to qualify the individuals that were there, that were working, they were understaffed. They did not have the kind of support that they really needed to serve the individuals that were there. To announce something that Mr. Carter had recently said, that particular facility was not designed to do what it was doing. So that's to give some credibility to the governmental staff, but still in all, it was created. So consequently, it was simply there to bring individuals in off the street. That was the initial concern. Get you out of the weather, maybe give you a meal, that was it. So the things that really needed to make people go forward, to have people go forward, the services, were not provided. So that's essentially what a low barrier shelter is.
So you've been homeless yourself, and
yes,
you have many homeless people who you think about in your everyday thoughts.
I have a problem getting back into structured employment environment, if I may say. I guess that's the best way to say it, because of my sentiment towards the individuals who have suffered the ideas of homelessness and poverty. I say homelessness because I was actually in that. To know, to actually experience that kind of idea, you know some of the needs that individuals have, and organizations, a lot of organizations just don't have it, simply because they do not talk directly to the people and know what those needs of the people are. Again, I commend this mayor and this administration to this degree for the short time that they've been in office to at least attempt to do that. I have great hopes in this new administration that it will address the needs directly to the individuals like the homeless persons by talking to the homeless persons and finding out exactly what these needs are and implementing new plans and programs that will kind of like, well, not kind of like, let me say, that will get us motivated to move out of homelessness.
Now, I was heartened to have a sidebar with Mr. Carter, to hear him say that the mayor was going to make good on his commitment, which he made as a council person and made again to the Washington Interfaith Network, that there would be 150 slots in the downtown as replacement for Franklin. That is the first time I have heard that said. There needs to be, I think, in every quadrant of the city, a safety net for people who fall into homelessness. I think that we will dramatically reduce homelessness through this effort, but I'm not sure, barring a miracle, that we will eliminate it. To eliminate homelessness would mean to take on every system that drives people into it, and I don't hear any discussion about that. We have a broken APRA system, we have a broken jail system, our hospital system is not so great, our Department of Employment Services does not step to the plate in working with people who are homeless. So there are a lot of pieces. Housing, affordable housing, which the mayor is trying to address to his credit, is a major issue for people in the District of Columbia and probably elsewhere.
Would you explain to us what the vulnerability index is?
Yes, the vulnerability index, in a very vague and general sense, it's just a scale that the government is going to use to determine who gets housed first, because we're only creating 400 units a year for thousands of homeless people. Every time that I ask about it myself, I get this very vague answer, because there's a list, a long laundry list of different criteria that would make you eligible for this housing, you know, and it ranges from drug addiction to alcoholism to mental illness to various physical illnesses, and so actually the answer I get, you know, is really not much of an answer, because I say who's going to get the housing first, and they give me about 5, 10, 15 different types of people that are going to be considered for this housing.
And if I could close the loop on Eric's discussion on the vulnerability index, the idea is that What we want to do is to accompany with the issue of length of stay these issues that make people at a greater degree of vulnerability, such as age, disability, substance abuse. Okay, those kinds of things make people more vulnerable. It helps us define who is the most chronically homeless. And the way that this initiative is designed is it is designed to get at first those individuals who are the most chronically homeless, the folks that Christy talked about, that Pathways to Housing specializes in. Because what we find is those individuals who are the most chronic, the most vulnerable, those are the individuals that require the greatest use of our resources to serve them. And so we find if we get them into housing and bring services to them, it is more cost effective and more humane and compassionate to serve an individual that way than either to have them using your emergency services systems as their primary systems or using shelter as housing, okay, or the incarceration system. So the idea of this, again, vulnerability index, it was to look at those conditions that make a person more vulnerable, if you will, more fragile, more acute, and you add that with length of stay in shelter to determine who we would make this opportunity available to first. If I could just slide back to another issue that Eric raised, I think, and Eric and I have, I believe, some wonderfully spirited conversations about how we move forward. And it's my sense that both of us share a passion for helping to end this issue, okay? Now, of course, we come at it from wildly different perspectives. Eric lives it. He understands it in a very, very intimate way, okay? The perspective I come from is a perspective of how does a government that has a desire to not have its people experience this condition, how does that government organize itself to end it? But I think together, I think that we really make a good team that helps to look at all perspectives of the issue. And so I think the important point I'm trying to make here is that I believe that there is amazing value in this sort of dialogue, okay? We cannot be in a posture where we from the government and we're here to help, we're going to tell you what we're going to do, okay? It really does need to be an exchange, a dialogue on how we go about solving the problem.
A very good first step. Finally, Streets would like to introduce a potential solution to the problem. No discussion is complete without offering a solution. Let's look at an organization that is presently providing all the wraparound services imaginable for the homeless in California. Let's look at the Path Mall.
Our whole approach is addressing homelessness on every level and coming up with tangible solutions for homeless individuals.
They'll come through the front door early in the morning. They meet with a case manager who assesses their situation and what kind of barriers they have.
Find them work-appropriate attire, help strategize in terms of their job search efforts, and then we give them ongoing case management. And then we work with them on a day-by-day basis, both in the employment aspect as well as the psychosocial aspect through the 3 months to make sure that their transition is smooth.
It's sort of like a social contract. Here's what we are offering, here's what is expected of you.
They come here and within a month they have to have a job.
And then they're expected to become productive and have their first and last month's rent saved up and be able to move out on their own.
Yeah, you got to go out there and save your money, and if you're not working, go look for a job.
So it's a program that tries to help the whole human being rejoin society.
The program is very successful. Over 60% of clients that come to us leave our center with housing and employment.
The Path Mall concept really is the prototype model of what needs to happen in order for the country to solve homelessness.
It's based on a multi-service, one-stop shop model of addressing a homeless person's needs.
So the idea is let's put all these places in one location.
Have all the various agencies under one roof so that homeless people don't have to go shopping around.
We have DPSS here, we have Travelers Aid here, we have family services here, we have a court once a month, we have the Path Health Clinic.
They can come here and get a haircut, they can clean up, and that, in a lot of ways, is the most important part of what we provide here.
We're trying to spread this idea so that collaboration and working together is something that doesn't just happen here on 340 North Madison, but it's something that can happen all over the country.
2 words: get involved.
Stay tuned, as these issues are certainly going to develop quickly within the next few months. I'd like to thank all my guests for their insight and passion. Most of all, I'd like to thank you, our viewing audience, for your time and future engagement in the lives of our homeless citizens. Continue to provide a hand up and not a handout, as together we strive to reach, educate, and transform society's views on homelessness. Till next time, this is Gloria Minot. Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Brenda Carol Lee Wilson, and today I'm going to be talking to you about housing for Streets Television. I've seen a bumper sticker in this district, and it says, houses. Everyone ought to have one before anyone has two. Makes sense to me, but I'm not here to make sense. I'm here to tell you that according to the National Coalition for the Homeless, the #1 reason for homelessness is lack of affordable housing. Now, I've always been able to pay my rent, no matter where I was, and how I became homeless was not because I couldn't pay my rent, but we're not going to go there. But since I came to the district and found out that in order for me to be able to obtain housing, I had to have a job. Well, I can't get a job without having a house, because when I tell people I'm living in a shelter, well, they immediately think, oh my God, incompetent in some capacity. That's not necessarily true. We all can become homeless for different reasons. But the fact of the matter is, you can't even find an affordable house here in the district. This is the lifestyles of the rich and famous. And in the 3 years and 6 months I've been here, I have seen so many houses be torn down and condominiums put up, and they're asking an ungodly price for them. What happened to people being able to afford a roof over their heads? If you work a 40-hour work week, whether you're a janitor or a rocket scientist, if you're working 40 hours a week, shouldn't you be able to afford a roof over your head? Maybe not the Taj Mahal like the rocket scientist, but I'm talking a little efficiency. You can't even touch one in the district unless you're working 3 jobs. Now, I just want to say one thing also. I heard that this mayor came out with a plan called the 10-year plan in order to get rid of homelessness, and I believe at that same time he came out with the plan that President Bush, he said that we're going to be colonizing Venus in 10 years. I have deduced that we are actually, the homeless, going to be living on Venus in 10 years, and I'm thinking that's pretty exciting. But how am I going to get there? Because if I can't afford a home, how am I going to afford a plane ticket there? But then again, I figure they're just going to ship us for free too, because that's the way they'll get rid of it. But it's not going anywhere. Let me just tell you that it keeps getting worse and worse. A lot of us that are homeless, we aren't welcome anywhere, let alone in someone's home. If you have a spare room, if you have a spare apartment, if you have something, make it available to a homeless person and help them get off the streets at least for a year. We ought to make it tax deductible when a person that, let's say, puts up a person in an apartment for a year, it's tax deductible for them, it's tax deductible for the person that owns the apartment, and help this person get on their feet, because we need at least 1 year to get our situation straightened out. Because once again, when we become homeless, our credit has become very bad, and unfortunately it makes it even more difficult to get housing. Thank you very much.